Good morning, Albert. Welcome back to Cincinnati.
Morning.
It's nice to have you. You know what we're going to try to do here today? We're going to look back, not in the future. You can bring in the future as it relates to the past, but this is being sponsored as far as the history of our medical school and of medicine in the U.S. So I guess we ought to begin at the beginning, when you were a kid. I know you were born in Russia or Poland, but I don't know any more about your early life, when you got here. So tell us a little bit of biography.
Well, I was born in a part of the world that was Russia at the time and became Poland after World War I. And my family, direct immediate family, was the last of the tribe to be there. So that even my paternal grandmother was in this country when I was born, and so practically the entire family was there. But our departure was delayed by the outbreak of World War I. The Germans came in very quickly. It was not far from the German border. So my first formal schooling was in a German language school where I went for 4 years and learned everything.
Did you speak Russian? Did you know Russian?
The Russian actually came along later because when the Germans left after the separate peace, it was a question of my either going to a private Russian gymnasium or a Polish school, and the Poles were very anti-Semitic. So I went to a private Russian school, learning then everything in Russian. So now I speak some Russian with a very good accent, but with a very limited vocabulary. But my frequent trips to the Soviet Union since 1956, or let's say from 1956 to 1975, brought some of it back. At any rate, after this additional year in a Russian gymnasium, in which I, of course, also learned other languages, the education is classical. You have Latin, and of course I learned French, and that's why my French accent is better too than it
Your English
would be.
isn't
Well,
bad.
I learned a little English.
When did you get to the States?
Well, I got to the States in 1900 and end of 20 or early 21, so that would be about 58 years ago. A little over 58 years ago.
How old were you then?
I was 13, going on 14, and then the first thing that happened was that I spent 6 weeks boning up with two of my cousins who are civil engineers. I learned about American history and everything in English.
This was where?
This was in New York City, but my parents settled in Paterson, New Jersey. And so when I went to high school there with my documents in Russian from that gymnasium, they looked at it, they say, "What does it mean?" It says, "It means that if there had been no interruption, I would probably now be finishing my sophomore class in high school." So they said, "We're going to give you a chance. We'll put you the sophomore year at high school," which I think it was just in March of 1921.
Wow.
And if you make out all right, you'll continue. If you don't, we'll set you back. Well, I made out, and so I graduated from high school in 1923 in Paterson, New Jersey.
At the age
Believe it
of,
or not, at the age of 17.
17? Right.
Going on 17. At any rate, and from then on, I moved to New York City.
Was the town you came from a little like the Fiddler on the Roof type of
No,
existence?
actually, the name of the town is Białystok.
Oh, big
it had
city.
100,000 population, and it had about 70,000 Jews in it, many of whom immigrated, but those who remained behind were all killed. When the Polish government invited me back for the first time in 1958, I asked to be taken there. There was only one Jew left, the guardian of the cemetery. And I was shown, incidentally, how when the Nazis first came in, 5,000 Jews were taken off the streets, pushed into a synagogue, and the whole synagogue was put on fire. So that's part of the story.
I don't want to start on this sad note.
At any rate,
let's get back then to
very briefly to a summary of my youth.
All right. Let's get back to your arrival in the U.S. How did you come by going to medical school?
Well, actually, I didn't start going to medical school because my parents were quite poor and didn't have the money to send me through the university. But my father's sister was married to a dentist, and my father's sister had a daughter who became a big movie star, Sylvia Sidney. She was only 12.
Sylvia Sidney.
And
was she a big movie star?
yes, well, they didn't have a son, so her second husband, Dr. Sidney, took me in and provided I would become a dentist. So my first exposure was pre-dental school, starting in 1923, and then I had the first 2 years of dentistry. And in the first 2 years of dentistry, the pre-clinical courses, very similar to that in medicine. So I was first exposed, and that's when I decided that I wanted to go to medicine. I left his bed and board.
What impelled you to go into medicine?
Well, actually, I think of all the preclinical sciences, bacteriology had the greatest impact on me. I read biography and so on, and as I've indicated before, not only did Aerosmith happen to come out in 1926, but the Microbe Hunters, I think, came out in 1925, and I was fired up with the challenge of epidemic diseases that might...
You never lost that, did you?
Well, it's because the challenge becomes ever greater.
What was Bellevue like as a medical school?
Well, Bellevue as a medical school was certainly rather more primitive, but it had a very good faculty. And I got a job in the Department of Bacteriology before I even was admitted to medical school, so that I worked in the Department of Bacteriology as a student, pre-medical student.
The chairman of that department was an interesting man named William H. Park. Can you give us a portrait as you remember him?
Well, Dr. William H. Park was one of the American microbiologists. He was one of the pioneers in microbiology. He was then not only professor, but director of the public health laboratories of the city of New York. And it is to him that I owe the opportunity that I had, because I had more nerve than knowledge, and his deputy turned me down when I asked for a place in the laboratory of the Department of Bacteriology. It was the same department for the dental school as for the medical school, but then I made an end run.
You did have a lot of nerve.
I made an end run around the deputy who said, you go back and learn more about physical chemistry and this and that and the other, and then come back. But I made an end run, and I must have broken Dr. Park's heart. He said, all right, as long as you won't disturb anybody, that corner in the laboratory.
As a medical student, you had a laboratory.
Oh, that's because I already had that laboratory before I was admitted to medical school.
Well, what kind of a student were you? Were you a good student?
Very bad, very bad.
Is that right? Your grades weren't so high?
My grades were bad. I flunked several times.
I hope all the medical students that listen to this appreciate there is still
The point
hope.
was, if you make up for it by concentrating on something else.
But you did other things as a medical student.
I was not universally good student. I concentrated more on certain things.
But as a medical student, you published your first papers. Do you remember?
As a medical student, you published already?
Oh, I published several papers as a medical student.
What on?
My first paper was in the Journal of the American Chemical Society on a very fundamental observation on diffusion in gels, a new phenomenon called barophoresis in gels, which incidentally Dr. Cumrow, writing about history of medicine, recently pulled out that paper. I suppose it was the first time it was ever quoted to show how people start on their careers. And then I became involved, again because I needed a job, I became involved with the big problem of pneumonia at the time. And because I left my uncle's bed and board, I was given a room at the Harlem Hospital in New York City where innumerable, quote, patients were admitted with pneumonia, and my job was to type the pneumococci that caused it.
Yeah, we used to do that.
And I was impatient, you see. I was impatient because I would come in after school and have 20 sputa perhaps to inoculate into mice, and wouldn't know, according to the existing technique, until the next day. And many of them were already dead by then. So the challenge was to develop a more rapid method for finding out, and I did.
Oh, yes.
And because of Dr. Park, and because he was a great man, he immediately put my name on it. And when I was in my first year of medical school, we already...
That was a big finding for you, wasn't it?
Well, but then there were...
How's it feel, that first paper, when you see it in print? I have that experience, but I want to know if you had it.
I don't remember.
It was such a thrill to me.
Each one has its own labor.
Oh, no
Pains,
question.
I mean, labor
Yeah.
pains.
No question, but the thrill of seeing it in print never, the thrill of discovery was greater than the thrill of putting it down on paper, huh?
Well, actually, I learned very soon that until you put it down on paper, you're just fuzzy.
Yeah.
You don't know what you have. The challenge of writing things out, putting it down on paper. Those of my colleagues who say, oh, my God, paper a month or whatever. If you don't write up what you do, you really aren't doing your job in scientific research.
Did you have much difficulty in getting an internship?
Well, I applied to Harvard. I was asked to apply, and I was asked to come up, and I flunked. Yeah, I don't know. Maybe I didn't say
Even
the right
having
thing.
written the paper,
Oh, yes, that's why I was asked, because when I was asked to come down...
who asked you? The Harvard people?
Yeah. At any rate,
It was a meta-
I had an internship at Bellevue Hospital, which included pathology, surgery, internal medicine.
Here you are, you're oriented to doing research at this early date. You really work under a superb clinician, John Wyckoff. How does he handle you?
Well, that's very interesting because I continued to do work in the laboratory while I was interning, and I guess he thought I perhaps neglected some of my duties. So on one occasion he called me in and he said, now, wearing my hat as chief of medicine, I must tell you, you've got to put more time in on this and that. Now he says, I'll take that hat off and I'll put on the hat as a clinician, a professor of medicine. He said, that last thing you did and published, that was really first rate. So try to develop a balance.
Now,
Did you develop a balance? You got better then.
Well, I really did a good bit of clinical work.
Now, one of the things that you did do during your internship was the discovery of a new virus that's called B virus, and I wonder if you could tell us some of the
Well,
circumstances
it's
about
one
that
of the
discovery.
tragic things, because before I began my internship, an event took place in New York City which actually affected my whole subsequent life. The biggest polio epidemic, next to the 1916 epidemic, occurred in New York City in the summer of 1931. And I was working in the laboratory still on pneumonia at the time, and I was asked by Dr. Park if I wouldn't. Actually, this is one of the times in my life when I didn't choose a field by myself. He says, please come in, we need some things in polio. And I started working on polio, and this young man, Dr. Brebner, came down. He was a Canadian, came down also to work on polio. He was bitten by a monkey, and he died while I was on surgery. This was then. And I isolated the virus, which I wanted, when it was submitted for publication, I called the Brebner virus, but Dr. Rouse, the editor of the Journal of Experimental Medicine, thought it was not proper, so it became the B virus, which subsequently...
Named after him.
Yes, the B stands after him.
Now, there was a debate about that virus, wasn't there?
Oh, you know, my life is full of stories because the big professor at Columbia University said, oh, it's not a new virus, it's just ordinary herpes virus. And because he knew so much, he was wrong, and because I knew so little, I was right, because it was the first demonstration that in the evolution of viruses, the primates have their own herpes viruses. And when they attacked human beings, they were very fatal. It's because I didn't know enough. Otherwise, I would have made the same mistake he did.
Now, when you were there, did you intend going into practice, or did you intend
No,
to...
I never intended to go into practice. I always intended to be in research. But to be in research in a way in which I would be my own clinician, my own pathologist, so that I wouldn't have to depend on somebody else to actually study problems in the field. I was always drawn to problems.
Did you need financing for your research, and if so,
sure.
did they give you grants in those days, or how?
Well,
how was it financed?
that's not the way it worked. You see, when I was a medical student, I had a scholarship. And then when I needed a little money to buy rabbits, or when I got into polio, some monkeys, there were always some funds. It didn't cost very much.
The medical school provided it?
Yes, well, Dr. Park, you see, he was a great manipulator. And while I was in the hospital also, the things that I did didn't cost very much. But again, there was an animal room in Bellevue Hospital that I could use at nights and so on.
You didn't have to reach in their pocket to pay for the animals, or did they supply
Well, I
them?
reached into somebody else's pocket. There are always ways,
yeah.
you know, there are ways to find, but it didn't cost as much as things cost.
But postgraduate training did cost. How did you get your postgraduate training?
Well, I wanted to go to Gloucester Institute, England, and I got a National Research Council fellowship. I almost didn't get it because Dr. Opie, who was at Cornell at the time and was interviewing me, didn't like me very much until I got around him a little bit. But Dr. Blake, who was then dean of the medical school, Yale Medical School, was chairman of the board. He had worked in pneumonia. He knew about my work in pneumonia. And we were already friends, and because during the polio days I also became acquainted with Dr. Paul and Dr. Trask. And
Who are these men?
These are the people at Yale Medical School who are among the leaders in American medicine or investigative medicine.
In that era.
So that when I applied for a National Research Council fellowship in 1933, the people who already knew me knew who I was, and I got that fellowship to go to England.
You went to the Lister Institute there. What was the institute like?
At that time, the Lister Institute was one of the great research institutes in England. It had excellent people in infectious diseases. It had excellent people in immunology and nutrition and physiology. It was a first-rate institute, although already the National Institute for Medical Research at Hampstead was buzzing, particularly in the field of virology. The Lister Institute was not very good in virology. So I spent part of my time and also the National Institute for Medical Research in Hampstead, in London. That's where the people they just discovered influenza virus.
While you were there?
Well,
Or
no,
before
just
you-
before, 1933, and I came Christmas time, 1933.
They train you, or you were already trained?
Well,
You
I
were
was on my own.
self-trained?
I had to train, but I learned. I'll tell you what I learned, because after an initial digression, I became associated with a wonderful neuropathologist, Dr. Edwin Hurst, and I learned a great deal about experimental neuropathology from him, to learn my way around the nervous system. And I learned a great deal from him, but I always worked alone. See, the ideas had to come
Had
from
trouble
me,
with
had to
your
come from me.
co-workers, huh?
I didn't have any trouble with co-workers except with one. I don't know this time for it.
I know one you had the trouble with, me, but that's another story.
No. This is in London. There was a man at the Lister Institute who just published a paper that he could propagate vaccinia virus without living cells. And Dr. Thomas Rivers at the Rockefeller Institute, whom I also knew by then, before I went over, he said, Albert, he says, now you go there and you find out how he can grow vaccinia virus without living cells. And you either show him where he was wrong, or you come back and show me how to do it. Well, unfortunately, I had to show the other guy where he was wrong. So that after
that, he didn't care.
After the first 6 weeks, you see, I didn't have anything to do with him, but I began to work with a first-rate person, Dr. Edwin Hurst, and we did fundamental work on neuropathology, and I also began my work there on immunity to viruses in general, because they had new ultracentrifuge that you see. There's a new technology that I wanted to utilize.
Did you make some discoveries there?
Oh, I guess I made some. Maybe I didn't interpret them the
Make
way
some-
I would now, but
Did you
there
make some
were
mistakes there?
mistakes in interpretation, not...
I mean, did you write a paper that you wish you hadn't written?
No, I think the observations are still all right. I had no trouble publishing. They were all published in the British Journal of Experimental Pathology. Quite a number of them while I was there.
How did you get to the Rockefeller Institute from the Lister Institute?
Well, that's because Tom Rivers was so delighted that I proved the other fellow wrong.
And he offered you a job, didn't he?
So actually, when the question was of where I would go after my year in England, he was I'm quite sure, influential in my being appointed to the Rockefeller Institute.
What was the Institute like when you got there?
What year are we talking about, too?
We're talking about
35?
January 1st, 1935. And of course, the Institute was one of the leading places for medical research in the United States at the time. It was still a little bit like Aerosmith,
It was.
but it was a wonderful, wonderful place in which to work.
What was Rivers like?
Oh, he was a person to whom I owe a great deal. Critical person, wonderful person. He was the father, unquestionably, of medical virology, as the book that Saul Dennison wrote about him testifies.
Maybe I should ask Saul whether you...
No, don't ask me. But I think there were interesting people, particularly in the laboratory that you worked.
Who else worked there of general who became famous or what?
Oh, everybody
famous before.
became famous.
Everybody was famous before.
Well, what are some of the names?
Well,
Name
I
drop
mean,
a little bit.
all right. I mean, taking the whole place, unquestionably, the man who is outstanding, still remains outstanding, is Avery, because the work they were doing on pneumococci is the very basis for our understanding of heredity. The whole. You can say that the work that Avery was doing there was the prelude to our new knowledge, the revolution in our knowledge of genetics and the whole genetic code. And there were people, and of course Simon Flexner was the first person in polio, and Lundsteiner, of course, was there, and on the same floor was Webster, who did a lot of work on encephalitis.
How did you and these men interrelate?
Well, I was able to learn a great deal from all of them, but I never asked them what to work on. See,
You chose your own
I
topic.
always chose my own.
Now, what did you work on essentially while you were at the Institute?
Well, in the first place, I continued with where I left off at the Lister. I was interested in continuing on nature of immunity, but I became interested in something that was going on at the Institute at the time, and that was the question of age and response to neurotropic viruses. So that I became involved in that and also on polio at the same time, and continued on polio. Because actually, when I broke off working on polio before starting my internship, I resumed it when coming to the Rockefeller
So
Institute.
there's a thread of polio all the way through.
Well, the polio came in, and the work on other neurotropic viruses enters the broad base for it, but I could say that while I did many other things while I was at the Rockefeller Institute, that polio represented the continuity.
Now, you made a discovery about the portal of entry of poliovirus that was in direct opposition to Flexner. Did Flexner ever say anything to you about that?
Well, the first, this is a very fundamental problem, because in trying to understand important human diseases, we need model systems. We can't do it all on human beings. And the model systems that were being used in polio as we see it now were misleading. For about 20 years we were on the wrong path, just as I think the model systems we're using in cancer research are misleading for human cancer. Now, at any rate, I tried to find out how you could tell whether or not what was the current conception of how poliovirus went into the human body was so or not. The conception was that it went in by way of the nose and went up along the olfactory pathway. And I found that when it did go up the olfactory pathway, that there were certain pathological changes, lesions in the olfactory bulbs, by which you could tell. Well, Simon Flexner was delighted about that. He said, oh, that's beautiful histologic work, pathologic work, beautiful. But then I took the next step. The next step was then to find out whether this happened in human polio. And when I did that, it turned out that it didn't, and that did make him very happy, because, but he was a wonderful, wonderful person.
How in the world did you find your way from Rockefeller to Cincinnati, which sounds like a step backward in the career on the face of it?
You see,
Not that I believe that.
That shows the inferiority complex that
That's right.
obtained at the time. I'm afraid still eggs over. But nevertheless, I had to face that. And it's just 40 years ago when I had to make that decision in March 1939, because I had to make a decision then as to whether or not to continue at the Rockefeller Institute. I had an offer. Or through Dr. Rivers, I had an opportunity to go to Sweden for 3 years. Or I had an offer to come to Cincinnati. And how was Cincinnati then linked with the Rockefeller Institute? The Children's Hospital, the Department of Pediatrics of the medical school here, had a very wonderful mechanism of controlling or implementing the work of its research foundation. They had a scientific advisory committee. On this scientific advisory committee were unquestionably the outstanding medical scientists in the United States at the time. Among them was Dr. Avery of the Rockefeller Institute. Dr. Goodpasture, although he was professor at Nashville University, was on the board of the Rockefeller Institute itself, Dr. A.N. Richards, and so on. So one day, I was asked to meet with this group, who were all Rockefeller Foundation or Board of Trustees or members, and that's when Graham E. Mitchell and Glenn Cullen, and incidentally Glenn Cullen was a former Rockefeller Institute man, yes, because he worked with Van Slyke, and he was professor at Vanderbilt, and he came here. He gave up his professorship at Vanderbilt, and he came to the Research Foundation. And that's when an offer was made to me of something that I wanted that I didn't have elsewhere. Because I wanted to have an opportunity to have access to patients with the disease that I was studying. The Rockefeller Institute at the time was divided in two parts. There was the hospital, and there were the laboratories. I was in the laboratories, and if I wanted patients, I had no access. And there were other things that happened. It would take too long. So at any rate, it was just 40 years ago, then in April, that I came down to look things over. And I was offered in Cincinnati at the time the things that I could not have at the Rockefeller Institute, the things that I would not have in 3 years, although we didn't know yet that World War II was on the way, in Sweden. And I'm very happy that I chose to come to Cincinnati. My life could very well have been quite different if I had remained in New York or gone to Sweden and then returned. But my coming to Cincinnati, the decision was made just 40 years ago, and then I came in September '39.
Now, did you continue your program of research as it had developed at the Institute, or did you develop new research here?
Well, in the first place, one of the things that happened towards the latter part of my stay in the Institute is that I discovered an experimental illness, a model illness in my studies that was so similar to human rheumatoid arthritis and also in part to rheumatic fever that I wanted to have patients. So then I had children with rheumatoid arthritis and rheumatic fever, which I tried to determine for myself whether or not the model system that I had in mice actually occurred in human beings. It was such an attractive model system that the chief of the rheumatic fever service at the Rockefeller Hospital, Dr. Swift, published an erroneous paper because he wanted to get ahead. At any rate, I worked on that. It turned out not to be the cause of either rheumatoid arthritis. But I continued also, I wanted to study all
So
children.
you did have some failures.
All children with
Oh, it wasn't a failure. It turned out to be.
It's not a failure. It's to establish the truth. My dear
How about
Ben,
serendipity?
my dear Ben, a failure is if you have a preconceived notion that you go out to prove. I didn't want to prove that human rheumatic fever or rheumatoid arthritis were caused by pleuropneumonia-like organisms. I'm a scientist, I hope, and continue to be, by asking a question, is it or is it not, to find out the answer. And if it is not, I do not consider a failure.
Of course, I appreciate that.
It might have been nicer.
It's very high-sounding.
It might have been nicer.
There is the expression that this raises in my mind, you see, that there is no question in my mind that it would have been a very appealing thing to you, and you were disappointed in not finding the truth. And the expression is, I don't mind you're urinating my eye, but don't tell me it's raining.
Well,
So
it's a
all right.
very nice Ben Felsen story, but permit me to say that it's not relevant.
All right. Okay, most of mine are. Let's get back to the subject in Cincinnati. You met a lot of people with whom I had contact subsequently too. Joe Warkany, who in his own right became very well known and made some outstanding contributions, and then some of the other people, Louise Rao, Bob Lyon, Stevenson, and some of the others. As you reminisce, were you working laterally with these people, overlapping, or were they totally independent?
Well, you see, at the Children's Hospital Research Foundation, there were a number of pathways that were being pursued. And I was particularly brought in to provide expertise in virology. Merlin Cooper was working particularly on the bacteriology of diarrheal disease. Now, diarrhea was a terribly important disease. At that time in Cincinnati, came the summer, there were kids just lined up being admitted to Children's Hospital dehydrated with diarrhea. And they were studying diarrhea bacteriologically at the time. And Dr.
George
Guest and Glenn Cullen were also involved in that. So they were intimately involved, centering biochemical, bacteriological, and other knowledge to deal with the big problem of infantile diarrhea. My job, I did not get involved in diarrhea. My job was to study infectious disease. And actually, I, of course, also continued polio because, to answer Saul Menison's question, I did obviously carry over from the Rockefeller Institute, where I left off, the question now, what is the actual natural history of the human disease, poliomyelitis? So I'm afraid I had many irons to the fire. Polio was one, encephalitis was another, which led me to the discovery of toxoplasma as a cause of human encephalitis.
Didn't you invent a test too?
Oh yes, well this was
done here?
This was worked out here, and so that there were many questions, and then very quickly, with the World War II breaking out, I was involved with what became the Commission on Influenza and Other Infectious Diseases of the Army, and immediately I became involved in studies on encephalitis. Viral encephalitis, which was expected to be a cause of trouble, which was already a cause of trouble in some of the training camps.
So how'd you get to sandfly fever and dengue? How do you pronounce that?
Dengue.
Dengue, okay. How did you get to
We are now in
the war years?
in the war. It's after Pearl Harbor. And working with this commission, there were epidemics of dengue fever already in Hawaii in 1942, 43, and sandfly fever was a disease that stopped the British, really knocked them out in Tobruk. So it was a very important disease. And I didn't get involved in sandfly fever until I was appointed to a commission to go to Egypt in 1943, within almost a month after I went into uniform. And dengue came along actually after I returned from Egypt and Sicily, and I had my unit, still my laboratory, working in Cincinnati, even though I was in the Army, and that's when I began to work on dengue, because it was occurring in Hawaii and among flyers and armed forces in New Guinea and so forth.
Did you demonstrate the etiology?
Well, you see, there were no, I mean, people knew that sandfly fever and dengue was caused by viruses, but nobody had a virus. Because, so first we had to get it into human beings and using volunteers, and then got it into mice, and this was the beginning of my extensive studies on volunteers, human beings. They used medical students and patients. And, oh, yes, you can.
Yes. The war years were essentially years of applied virology. Did you?
All my life were years of applied virology. I don't like that term, applied, because it gives, excuse me, Saul, we've been through this before. It gives an impression to those that you're taking knowledge that's there and you're using it. The fundamental studies on diseases that are caused by viruses, it's not applied. They are things where we have to get knowledge that doesn't exist. Now, you may ask a question about something that's in nature, about something that has nothing to do with what's occurring in nature. So, as you know, I prefer the expression categorical fundamental research, which has to do with fundamental research with a specific category of a disease, or non-categorical. Non-categorical research would deal with problems in virology that may be related to many different kinds of diseases, may have no relationship. They're both very important. I would say that my work through most of my lifetime has been categorical fundamental research, trying to get knowledge previously not in existence on diseases that represented a challenge because of the lack of knowledge.
One question and jump a little bit, and that is, when did you realize you had the polio vaccine?
When the United States Public Health Service in August 1960 said, we now accept this as these strains as the strains of virus for a live polio virus vaccine in the United States.
So you didn't,
Because you see, it doesn't come eureka, because it took actually 30 years of fundamental research. And there were many, many periods when it seemed that that one factor or another would mitigate against it.
a lot of disappointments in those 2 years.
It would have been very easy to quit at certain
Did you come
times.
upon it not serendipitously, but while you were, by accident, while you were doing something else, or were you aiming directly for the vaccine?
I've had some serendipitous experiences in my life, but they were not related to polio. Polio was just following a plan, asking questions, getting answers, going on to the next question, question after question after question.
You were so sure that Salk's methods were going to turn out not the permanent ones. And of course, this was a sensational public battle in the news, in the press, in the medical circles. How could you have been so sure that his method was off when he thought he had the right method?
What you just said is an impression you've carried around in your mind and still do, which is wrong. I was never sure of anything. I was never sure of anything. I had reason to believe that that did not provide the answer for the ultimate elimination of poliomyelitis. It was a procedure that had to be used. It was the quickest one as soon as it became possible to grow polio virus on a large scale and to formalize it. I mean, the technology was available. But it quickly became evident that both in the field and in experimental studies that it could not influence very well the continuing transmission of polioviruses. And that ultimately, the provision of the kind of immunity that was similar to the natural infection was necessary. I wasn't sure that it was going to work. I wasn't sure until it actually worked.
And you did a lot of testing on...
my goodness.
And what countries were
what
you?
countries? Before what countries? We'll take first of all the United States, Chillicothe, Ohio.
That was a correction.
And I went in 1900 and actually January 54 it was, trying to get permission to ask for volunteers in this federal prison where there were mostly young people. And I took my life in my own hands. The roads between Cincinnati and Chillicothe were icy, and I thought I was going to go off the road or something at any moment. But when I arrived at the prison, the warden, it was up to him to decide whether he was going to let me interfere with his routine, said I had my mind made up that I would say no to you. But when I saw you arriving here in this horrible weather, I decided to go and give you a chance and talk to the men directly. And when I did, and I had to explain to them the possible hazards that I could not measure or describe to them, to those who didn't have any immunity to polio, it came to my mind that the chance, the risk I took of driving there to ask them was much greater than any risk, unknown, unpredictable.
You told
risk.
them that?
Yes, I told them that.
You're a great salesman always.
Well, still,
That's true.
however, not misrepresenting the product.
All right. And what about, you had a lot of problem getting the vaccine tested in the public, or accepted by the public in the United States when they were testing in other countries widely.
Let's again get things distinguished. The public and the public health service are not the same thing.
Yes, of course.
All right. So number one, there are various stages. You see, we went through from hundreds of volunteers at Chillicothe, then to my own children and the neighbors here in Cincinnati. And then it was necessary to go from tens to hundreds to thousands, and all that was done during a period leading up to about 1957. And by then it was necessary to go on a larger scale. It was not easy in this country because the National Foundation for Infantile Paralysis didn't want anything to interfere with the drive to get as many children vaccinated with Salk vaccine as possible. On the other hand, in order to get work done elsewhere in the world, there had to the action is taken by committees. And there was a World Health Organization committee that decided, yes, now is the time to go on a larger scale. So there was more done abroad than in the United States. But ultimately, you see, it came down to where it was accepted in the United States, and then the problem was production. It's one thing for the Public Health Service to accept, and it's another thing to get private enterprise to take the risk of production and changing and so on and so on. It's a big story.
There was a big story in
Interesting story.
Cincinnati when you said nobody should pay for the vaccine.
Well, you see, some of the initial big tests were actually carried out in Cincinnati. We had here a situation in 1959, no, it was 1960, where we had one of the first really large tests in the country where all the school children of Cincinnati received the
remember
vaccine.
that.
And the point was that when we came subsequently to actual mass vaccination that was carried out by a special plan recommended by the American Medical Association, etc., the whole idea was that this should be a mass program in which physicians and everybody else involved give their services free. But this was worked out, first of all, not by me, but by a wonderful procedure by pediatrician Richard Johns in Phoenix, who established the method for the big Sunday mass vaccination procedures.
Yeah.
And that's when the county medical societies really accepted it. And it was a wonderful manifestation of medical societies working together with their communities and giving their services free. It was a great thing.
Some of the trials took place in Russia. How did that happen?
Well, that happened because they came here in 1956, Russian virologists, 2 years after big epidemics began to appear in Russia. They said before that we didn't have any. And they came here to learn how to make Salk vaccine. They also came and visited with me here in Cincinnati in 56 and then invited me over to go to the Soviet Union for the first time in 1956. And then there began a collaborative effort. And they carried out the largest tests. At the end of, in 59, there were 10 million or more persons involved. And it was the first country in which the Ministry of Health said this shall be the only vaccine that will be used in the Soviet Union. And of course this meant their satellites, and this had a great impact. Well, it's a big story which you've already covered.
Well, we're about at the end of this interview, but I would like to ask one question.
Has it already gone by?
Yeah.
Oh, then you see, obviously we covered a few things only.
Quite touched the high spots. That's all you can do in the situation. But there's one question that I'd like to ask. I've been wanting to ask you this for a long time. The young guys today, the young students, are not really going into nearly as much as your era, as best I can tell, as for full-time careers, or at least they don't stick at it. You've had a long and distinguished career. You stuck it your guns, and it paid off in a variety of ways for medicine and for the people you were in contact, in the schools you were in contact with. What do you have to offer in the way of suggestions for younger people who are in the fields, various fields of research today?
I hope you'll forgive me for disagreeing with your first premise, namely that not as many are going in now as did
Well,
before.
there are more students, but I mean
because
percentage-wise.
my own feeling is that there are more now than we need, and too many are doing things that are unimportant, insignificant, just because it's the fashion to do something. There are many more people in the field now who shouldn't be in there proportionately than there were, let's say, 40 years ago or 50 years ago when I entered the field. So the real issue is, for those who are going into the field of biomedical research, to still look at the important problems and to pick a piece of the action which is specifically related to biomedical research, and not do general biology and think they're doing biomedical research. There's a need for a tremendous subdivision of labor with the great expansion of our existing knowledge, and therefore with the expansion of the needs for new knowledge. And so I would say that I personally hope very much that the trivial kind of work that's being done, there's a lot of trivial work being done, should not be supported. But people who go in should have a dedication to, if they go in, particularly if they're trained in medicine, to ask the questions that only they can ask. A PhD has a contribution to make. There's no question about that. But those who know disease, trained as physicians, should ask questions in relation to some of the very important diseases. I recently made a list of all the things we don't know, and it's really a tremendous list. But why?
Name
and
five.
Then I said, name five. All right, I'll name one right away that people will say, oh, well, we've conquered infectious diseases. Acute respiratory bed-disabling disease is the leading cause of bed-disabling illness in the United States, in which all the research that's been done is way off. And then, of course, we've got the malignancies, we've got cardiovascular disease, we've got stroke, and we've got a whole slew of others. In mental illness, we have problems that really are most challenging. But when I made this list of 25 or so, I said to myself, I'm nevertheless an optimist. And then I made a list of 40 or so, which at the time I began, or certainly at the beginning of this century, were mysteries. And yet, the scientific basis for diagnosis, prevention, control was found. So I think the pursuit, the persistent pursuit of biomedical research will ultimately also bring us the knowledge which, as I sometimes like to say, will make it possible for all of us to die in good health.
On that note, I think I want to say thanks, Albert, for coming and making this, accepting this interview, and Saul for coming along and helping me with it. I'm sure that future generations will appreciate this particular hour that we've had.
With respect and admiration, Ben, as usual, it's been a pleasure.
All right. So, thank you, Saul. Cut. It was great. Hello, I'm Dr. Benjamin Felsen, a radiologist and professor of radiology in the Department of Radiology of the University of Cincinnati College of Medicine. In addition to that specialty, I have a subspecialty. I'm an Albert Sabin introducer. In actual fact, this is the 7th time I've had the opportunity to introduce Albert Sabin, and I wonder why. I think it's because mainly that I'm a hero worshiper and have been a longtime friend of Albert's, and that he doesn't quite resent my brashness when I introduce him. Incidentally, this is being taped at another time because Albert didn't have enough time beforehand to stay long enough, and therefore I didn't occupy the time introducing him. As a matter of fact, I feel much more relaxed when he's not around when I introduce him, but I've never tried that before. As you shall see, Albert is a versatile talent. He is not only a scientist, a humanitarian, he's a fine orator, and he's an intense political being. Versatility, he's like Da Vinci, I guess, but Da Vinci shouldn't suffer by comparison. I think Albert's the only true genius I've ever known. He is a tenacious scientist. Not only was he involved and really helped solve the polio problem, but as you'll see, he was also an expert on toxoplasmosis, dengue fever, sandfly fever. He discovered the bee virus. All this will come out in the interview. His research, I should point out, generally solved the issues when he put his mind to it. He was like the great microbe hunters of the past. I have my own fantasies since reading Paul de Kreef's Microbe Hunters when I was a teenager. I've always wanted to be a microbe hunter and discover big things, but I've never managed except in my fantasies. And Albert has managed to do all the things and is also, therefore, one of the great microbe hunters. He is also a great humanitarian. One example, just to show the point. When the polio vaccine was being promulgated and being distributed, Albert said no one should ever pay for his polio vaccine, and that, in fact, was the case. He managed somehow to get the vaccine to millions of people without any charge to the individual. There was certainly no profiteering in this regard. Also, when Albert had become successful and was traveling the world among famous people, among other things, he was in Tito's presence and tried to talk Tito into interceding with the Russians to let the Jewish people who were trying to get to Israel leave permission to leave the country. Albert has had many prestigious awards for his scientific accomplishments. He won the Theobald Smith Award, the Feltrinelli Award in Italy, the Lasker Award here in the United States, and some of these have, by the way, netted a fair amount of money. He also has won many gold medals, for example, that of Mexico and certain other countries, the French Legion of Honor, and many others that I don't want to go into, but I would point out that there's been no change in his personality since success has reached him. He is the same intense, impatient, sometimes irascible person he always was. His temper, by the way, is well known to many of us. He's always been the champion of the underdog. He's met with the royalty and heads of states all over the world, Kosygin, Tito, Hirohito, the Japanese. He's particularly famous over there. They keep sending him color TV sets. He said once to me that he thought he ought to go into the business of selling them. So I'm a hero worshiper. An illustrative situation occurred in the swimming pool when my son, two kids and I and Albert were swimming at my home, and we were standing there talking in the pool when my son came up, my teenage son, and he said, "Hey, there's a warm spot here in the water." And I turned and I said, "You know what that means?" And he said, "What?" And I said, "Somebody urinated in the water." He turned to Dr. Sabin, and he said, "Dr. Sabin, my father is honored to swim in your warm spot." Professor Saul Benison, who's a professor of the history of medicine in the university here, and is Albert's biographer, will help me with these these questions and interview Dr. Sabin with me. Good morning, Albert. Welcome back to Cincinnati.
Good morning.
It's nice to have you. You know what we're going to try to do here today? We're going to look back, not in the future. You can bring in the future as it relates to the past, but this is being sponsored as far as the history of our medical school and of medicine in the U.S. So I guess we ought to begin at the beginning, when you were a kid. I know you were born in Russia or Poland, but I don't know any more about your early life, when you got here. So tell us a little bit of biography.
Well, I was born in a part of the world that was Russia at the time and became Poland after World War I. And my family, direct immediate family, was the last of the tribe to be there. So that even my paternal grandmother was in this country when I was born. And practically the entire family was there. But our departure was delayed by the outbreak of World War I. The Germans came in very quickly. It was not far from the German border. So my first